understanding the Bible is so important to our Christian walk. Thank you for taking time to look into some of the principles and rules and techniques and tools for understanding the Bible better. I believe this is the 7th video, the 7th session or episode, looking into understanding God's book and looking at the 8 interpretation rules. And so today's video is looking at the interpretation rule of logic. Don't get lost in the language. Remember that the interpretation rule of logic boils down to your interpretation should make sense. Logic. We're not very logical people, are we? The Bible was given to us in the form of human language and therefore appeals to human reason. It invites investigation. It invites study and digging. It is to be interpreted as we would any other writing. We should be applying the laws of language and grammatical analysis. That's why I'm a grammar geek. We need to ask, after we investigate a passage, does the interpretation make sense? That's the rule of logic. Does the interpretation make sense? Because it should make sense. The more explaining required, the further away from the truth of the text is a good sound gauge of logic. If 10 people read the same passage and are asked, what does this passage mean? Their answers ought to be relatively close to one another. If the 10th person has some left field, wild interpretation of it, they're probably wrong. Logic is a colossal subject, and we don't really talk about logic enough. They don't teach it in school anymore, where logic requires inference and competent evidence and satisfactory evidence. An inference is a fact reasonably inferred by another fact. It all boils down to there ought to be a chain of thinking between one idea and the next idea and the next idea. And that's why it ought to be kind of a common conclusion, where if you have 10-year-olds read a paragraph, and after reading the same paragraph, the 10-year-olds, they'll come up with the same answer. They'll come up with the same chapter heading for what it's talking about. And normally that's because, 10-year-olds are really good at basic logic and we get fancy. And so we try to jump to conclusions and make ourselves seem smart. And then we have to expend so much time trying to explain how we got there and how we're right. And most of that just means that we're climbing further and further out on a limb until we fall completely out of the tree of interpretation. Jesus used this logic, looking at language and grammatical analysis and how the interpretation ought to make sense. He did this. Jesus did this. He used this rule when he proved the resurrection of the dead to the unbelieving Sadducees in Matthew chapter 22, verses 23 through 33. So if it's a good enough rule for Jesus, it's a good enough rule for us. These rules are stacking up, and they will each help us understand a passage. So we can take a passage and literally work our way down the rules, and then back up through the rules, and then down the rules again, making sure that we're gleaning everything we possibly can. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching these videos.